So it's about 10 o'clock now, ladies and gentlemen, so we may as well start. So welcome to our, was it the penultimate Friends of Air Force History and Heritage Zoom for 2021. Hasn't the year gone quickly? Boy, it's been a very different year in a lot of ways. So just a bit of a plug for our last Zoom for the year, which will be on Friday, December the 3rd. We've got a bit of a special guest speaker from the Australian War Memorial coming along, and I think it'll be a very interesting presentation, and I'll get all the details out to you within the next week or so. Just waiting for them to come back and confirm they're still available. Today, of course, we welcome Air Commodore Ian Pearson. Welcome, sir. And he's going to talk to us about his book, Cold War Warriors. Just a little bit about his career. Air Commodore Pearson joined the Air Force in 1976 and trained as a navigator. Navigators are good blokes. Being the daughter of a navigator, I'm very supportive of navigators and know what they do for a living and how hard they work. After training, he served with 10 Squadron, had 2 postings with 10 Squadron. Was on attachment with 11 Squadron and postings 292, and then onto Offshore Protection Command, which was subsequently renamed Border Protection Command. And of course, you know, everyone's got to do those staff duties sooner or later. So he then served as a staff officer at CDF. You can't get any better than that. And nearly 3 years at DPO. So any of you who've got whinges about some of your postings, here's your opportunity to discuss them within now. And reminds me about the time someone said to me, we're thinking of posting you in, you need to, or someone wrote something in a report saying, would be very good at writing sensible personnel policy. So thank God I managed to avoid that. And of course, Air Commodore Pearson was Deputy Commandant at the Australian Defence Force Academy, and that's where I had the great honour of serving with him as his staff officer. And of course, the story about Cold War Warriors, and as it says on the blurb of the book, it tells the little-known story of operations by the Royal Australian Air Force's P3 Orions during the later years of the Cold War. Aircraft's largely low-profile mission, usually flown far from their base, often crowded in confidentiality. And now, with access to D-class documents, it's allowed their whole story to be told. Very warm welcome to you, sir, and we'll hand over to you and look forward to your presentation. We'll do the usual thing, presentation of about 40 minutes, and then I will ask a few questions. And then we'll open it up for questions. So once I can get this cat out of the way, so we'll just ask you to all go mute and possibly even just turn off your video so that there's no distractions. So anyway, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly. Thanks for the interest you've shown by tuning into this presentation. I guess I'd say right up front, this isn't a sales pitch. Air Force paid for the book to be published, which was very kind. So I say to anyone who buys the book that they're helping to pay down the COVID debt. The first print run, according to the publishers, is sold out, and I understand it's undergoing a second print run with minor typos like Cav-OK for Bill and a few others corrected. So that should be available in the new year if you're after a copy. The book is a large format book. It looks like a coffee table book, but I can assure you it's not. It's a fairly serious history book. It's got some pictures too, if you like pictures. So it has 438 numbered pages. It weighs 1.94 kilos, so it's a good doorstop if nothing else. And we're discussing it earlier. I don't think many people will be sending them overseas as gifts. The last person who did that told me it cost them $77 to send to the US. So speaking of pictures, let me see if we can get the the sharing arrangements working. So I guess I'd like to start by acknowledging some of the key players that were involved in the book. People like Denny Neve from Big Sky Publishing. If anyone's written a book, if I tell you that the guy has the patience of a saint, you'll probably be very jealous, because that's the sort of person you need. Fredo, you all know Fredo. Without his boundless energy, this book wouldn't have seen light of day. He steered it through, dare I say, bureaucratic inertia, and perhaps even some hurdles to get it through the publication process. So, in a world full of leaners, I'd characterise Fredo as one of the shifters. In the book, you'll also see, and this is another acknowledgement, I suppose, but the magnificent artwork of Juanita Franci. I asked for her to do 6 different profiles of aircraft, 3 from each squadron to be even-handed. And hopefully this is what you're seeing when I can advance the slide. Basically, 11th Squadron Aircraft 291 as it appeared on delivery. And that aircraft is still flying. All 6 aircraft selected are either still flying or in a museum, or in the case of 753, qualify on both counts. So Winnie did an outstanding job. So what is the book about, and why did I write it? Well, I guess Marianne has very kindly taken that part of my presentation for me to save me a bit of time, because I'm going to be short of time. But I'd say, going back to World War II, for the historians amongst you, and I guess that's all of you, the maritime aviators of the day were part, in the European theatre at least, were part of RAF Coastal Command, and they were completely overshadowed in the media and everywhere else by their counterparts from Fighter Command and Bomber Command. And Coastal Command was referred to for that reason as the Cinderella Service. And I have my suspicions, but I think that that title is as appropriate now as it was 80 years ago. So Cold War Warriors, in my view, was a story that needed to be told and done so before being completely airbrushed out of history. Now, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the book has 438 numbered pages. But you can relax. I'm not going to go through every single page. Just looking at the contents, this is how the book is laid out. Just to set the scene, and I said I'm not going to read every page, but I do want to start off with a bit of reading from the prologue, which I guess sets the scene. So it starts off with girt by sea, not by beach. Australia is a maritime nation, its geostrategic circumstances defined by the oceans that surround the large island continent. Over 99% by volume of Australia's exported and imported goods, and over 81% by value, are dependent on shipping. So before the distortions of COVID in 2019, Australia exported by sea goods to the value of 329.7 billion, while importing by sea goods to the value of 258 billion. External threats to Australia must travel across, under or over the surrounding oceans to threaten maritime trade bound for or originating from Australia, or to reach this island continent. Failure to detect and overcome such threats in what the 1986 DIB report referred to as the sea air gap has the potential to put at risk Australia's security. So enough reading. As you might have noticed from the table of contents, the first title of the first chapter is Genesis. I'd like to think all the chapters have got catchy titles. I want to start by giving an idea of how early part of the aircraft history is covered in the book. Just to give you an idea of how the book flows, I guess. And if we've still got time, and I notice I've only got 40 minutes, I'll cover some of the roles performed by the aircraft. and that'll involve bouncing around the aircraft a bit rather than going chapter by chapter. Now, I expect all of you will know that 11th Squadron was the first RAF squadron to take delivery of the Orions, and that was that the first 3 of those aircraft arrived at Edinburgh on the 13th of May 1968, as you can see in this photo. But how many of you knew that for a different decision being taken by the Air Board, it could have been 10 Squadron that took delivery of our first Orions? So how did that happen? I want to go through the timeline of the early part of the P3's history, and from that you'll notice that the subtitle of the book, while suggesting the story starts in 1968, in fact goes back almost 20 years before that. So I mentioned about 20 years before, in fact, November 51, the P2B5, as they were then called, Neptunes, were delivered to 11 Squadron. But 10 Squadron had been operating Lincolns at that time, and in fact, before that, since 1949. Moving along to August 1957, so I'm just quickly going to go through a timeline. The US Navy issued technical specification 146 for the replacement of its P2 Neptunes and P5 Marlin flying boats. December 57, we see the first Electra prototype, Lockheed Electra prototype flying. And very shortly after that, an aircraft based on the Electra was announced as the winner of the Naval Technical Specification 146 for the US Navy. Moving ahead again, the YP3V1-1 Electra demo flight flew in August 1958. So things are happening fairly quickly, I guess is the point I'm trying to make here. And again, months later, the Electra entered service with Eastern Airlines. Bad news, shortly after that, with a crash of one of the Electras, 65 fatalities. That was attributed to what they called the whirl mode, and I beg your pardon, that was attributed to pilot error. So in that same time frame, the Air Board was looking for a replacement for the Mark 31 Lincoln flown by 10 Squadron. And the contenders at the time were the Shackleton, the Mark III Shackleton, the Canada Argus, and the Lockheed P3V Electra, along with the Neptune that was offered. Now, perhaps lacking the boldness that was later shown with the selection of the F111, the Air Board ruled out the P3V. It saw it as being probably able to meet its requirements, but beyond the Air Force's means at $6.8 million per aircraft, and not expected to be available until 1963. Also, I suppose the crash of the American Airlines accident, which at the time, by the way, was the largest civil airline disaster in history, that probably didn't help the cause of the Electra. So as events transpired, I would say that the Air Board probably made a good call, because shortly after that, perhaps to vindicate their decision, Braniff lost an Electra with 34 fatalities. In November 59, so shortly after the Braniff crash, the YP3V1 flew. It was 7 feet shorter. It had avionics fitted and sensors, and the airline windows of the prototype had been removed. And basically, just a quick comparison between the original prototype and the updated prototype. You can see the more characteristic Lockheed Orion nose, the refined MAD installation. The windows have gone, as I mentioned, and it's a bit shorter. And just once again, almost to seal the fate of the Electra, Northwest Orient crashed with 63 fatalities. Subsequently, they were attributed to what was known as a whirl mode, which was connected to a weakness in the engine mounting that resulted in wing flexing and subsequent failure at the wing root. But As we know, the AIRCDRE did go on to a career with a number of airlines, but with 3 fatal accidents in just over a year, along with the growing success of jet airliners, the orders for the AIRCDRE are essentially killed. The big beneficiary of the investigations into the well mode was the development of the P3. So only 170 AIRCDREs were manufactured. 170 AIRCDREs were manufactured. 757 Orions were manufactured. 650 by Lockheed and 107 by Kawasaki. And moving along, just to show how the Air Board did have its act together, in March 61, the Mark 31s were grounded unexpectedly when they discovered corrosion. And the last one to fly was A7365, which flew up to Darwin, ended up on the fire dump, unfortunately. Not a happy ending for any aeroplane. In the timeline again, the P3V1, and this is the old Navy nomenclature. If you're wondering why we talk about P3V1, the V stands for Vega. It's all explained in the book. I won't go into the detail unless anyone wants that, but the letter L for Lockheed had already been taken. So P3V1 was christened the Orion with a bottle of bubbly or whatever it is that the lady is spreading all over the aeroplane. Essentially, the Orion went serviceable with the US Navy in July 1962, and by November 62, we're seeing images of it flashed on our TV screens as it was enforcing the blockade for the Cuban Missile Crisis. By now, at this stage, we've got, if we just move ahead, we've got 11 squadrons still stuck with its old Neptunes. They were a world of difference to the Neptunes that were delivered to 10 Squadron. The Neptunes that 11 Squadron flew essentially had World War II avionics, whereas the P2V7s, as they were then called, that 10 Squadron had, later SP2H, essentially had the same avionics as the earliest Orions. So these Neptunes that 11 Squadron are flying are starting to get pretty long in the tooth. And so it's probably no surprise that we find ourselves with the Americans visiting us with an Orion in April 1964. This is taken in Canberra. And the admiral aboard, apparently with a completely straight face, told the media that this is not a sales visit. This is a this is not a marketing visit. This is just a goodwill visit. Well, his next port of call was New Zealand, and they actually became the first overseas customer for the Orion in late 1966. So if we move on from April 1964, that visit then, months later, November, the then Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, is telling Australia that we're now buying 10 Orions for 11 Squadron. So I suspect it probably was a pretty good marketing trip, certainly successful. If I just go back a little bit though, by now we've got, or go ahead at least a little bit, by now we've got Australian aircrew becoming involved with the P3 one way or another, just eyeballing it, as is seen here in the tarmac at Barbers Point in Hawaii. Or we had guys like the late Tom Trinder, who was a great contributor to the book. He was on the Neptune exchange with the Canadians, and during that time, he had logged 43 hours of P3 time, long before we saw any P3s in Australia. So here we are on the tarmac at Barbers Point, and the fellow on the extreme left there, I don't know if you can see my mouse circling, but anyway, extreme left of the photo is Paul Fuller. I'll mention him later on, but Paul was quite a photographer, thank goodness, and we're all the beneficiary. Moving along very quickly then, November 1967, crews started flying across to Naval Air Station Moffett Field, which is just south of San Francisco, and what is referred to now as Silicon Valley. And in fact, this is at Mountain View, which is the headquarters Google. And they started their conversions to the P3B. This would start the professionalisation of the RAF Maritime Force, which up till then, I think it's fair to say, had been a bit of a cowboy outfit. And to give you an example of that, pilots, for example, would carry their own performance figures that they'd collated themselves. So they just didn't have the sort of manuals and so on that were then provided during the conversion by VT31, the West Coast conversion outfit. The conversion was conducted in accordance with a proper syllabus, proper documentation, and that included authoritative flight manuals. If you look at the slide, there's this huge hangar, and you can get an idea of the size by the scale of the aeroplanes. They're real aeroplanes, not models. That's hangar 1. So that was an airship hangar for the Akron and Macon and so on, the big airships that the Americans had in the 30s. You can see there's another couple of hangars across the other side of the airfield. This Shenandoah Parade, the headquarters, and this little building by the water tower here, little building here. Oops, that one there, I mean. These days, this is a civil airfield now, essentially. And there's that little building. It's now the Moffett Field Museum. You can see the hangar 1 has been stripped. I took this photo a couple of years ago, just before COVID. It's been bought by Google. Google owns it. Presumably it's going to be repurposed for something else. What that something else is, I'm not quite sure. But moving back again to getting the P3B, we've got the handover of 291 on the 10th of January. That's at Burbank, before the aeroplane flew from Burbank, the Lockheed plant at Burbank, to Moffett Field for the guys to train on. So a couple of personalities, I guess you can see in this photo. Russ Law, Russ Law, the CEO of the squadron. Jeff Michael, who was the wing commander on exchange at the time, was a bit of a hero in the P3 story. Rear Admiral Buster Crabb, he was the head of the Defence Staff in Washington, and this guy here, Fred Roby, Neptune pilot, and he was the air attaché. Some interesting stuff about him in particular in the book. His ability to determine the cause of an accident from his desk in Washington was remarkable. So the P3 came into service with the guys training on it, and to use the words of Paul Fuller, Neptune AEO at that time, he described it as the answer to a maiden's prayers. And it was on so many levels, but this diagram just gives you a bit of a feel for the size comparison between the two aircraft. So gone are the days of a great big wing spar obstructing the passage down the length of the fuselage. You could walk down this. After all, was an airliner, so it had a few basic benefits of that heritage, like for example, it had a proper toilet, which was a pretty important thing. It also had a galley down the back. And I would maintain that a generation of guys, 10 squadron, and I say guys because we didn't have female aircrew in those days, but a generation of guys, Australian guys, learned how to cook in that galley. As seen with Canberra doing the honours in this particular photo. It was pretty impressive capability. It also had bunks down the back there, and they were pretty important for long transits, particularly when we were carrying groundies that might have been working on the aircraft overnight, or guarding the aircraft, and we all had guys guarding the aircraft on certain bases. So all was going well with the conversion, and by early April, after 4 months from home, the first 3 crews were getting ready for their departure to Edinburgh. and I've got a bit of scratchy film taken. This was a formation flight on the 8th of April, and while it's very scratchy and poor quality, it's quite historic. It shows 296. If you look closely, you'll see 296. It's the aircraft just off screen at the moment, but you'll also see the red diamond on the fin. Now, for the engineers, this is probably the sort of stuff that gets you excited. This was an illegal mod directed by the CO to help differentiate the aircraft on the flight line. It was removed not too long after the aircraft arrived back into officialdom and to Australia. But that's why 291 that I showed you before is shown that way. Okay, so a few days later, 296 was flying circuits at Moffett Field with Tom Trinder as the captain of sea crew and a total of 8 persons aboard. That was significant because up till then they'd been flying with crews of about 20 with all the instructors and full crews. So all was going incredibly well until they did a touch and go, and at that stage the port undercarriage separated from the aircraft, and this was the result. Aircraft caught fire. All 8 crew members successfully evacuated the aircraft from the starboard overwing exit. It's quite a saga in itself. Tom Trinder was the last one out. He got a singed backside. And one of the AEOs, Gordo Johnson, sustained minor injuries, but essentially they all survived and did incredibly well. It was a great crew effort to go from flying one moment to literally seconds later, all successfully evacuating, with Paul Fuller, the fellow I mentioned earlier, stopping and taking photos and having to be told to run away because the thing was about to blow up. So this was the result. That's $6 million worth of aeroplane there, reduced to that. So quite a sad sight. And here's the culprit. Basically the port undercarriage, it was a forging error. Once again, long story. The part had been identified as defective, but it was still fitted to the aircraft. Now that aircraft, that wheel sort of took off and ended up on the other side of the airfield, not on the highway as you might have read elsewhere, not from the starboard side of the aircraft as you might have read elsewhere. And it was the diligence of 11th Squadron pilot Cole Pryor and the engineering officer Jack Worth, who did an emu bob of the airfield, that they found the wheel, and they brought it to the officers' club that evening where the guys were having a bit of a debrief, I think a bit of a drink, and their words were, "We have the wheel and Lockheed's not going to get it." So that was pretty pivotal. Now, this is a photo of the crew minus one guy, Mick Dunn. I don't know where he is, but this is in the hangar, waiting to give evidence to the inquiry that was convened days later. And Jeff Michael conducted the inquiry. I mentioned Paul Fuller before, so here he is on the left again. And the aircraft captain, Tom Trinder. I won't go through all the names, but it's a very poor quality photo. It came to light after the book was published. In fact, the widow of this fellow here, who used to be my instructor, Vince Hooper, sent it to me. But it's like a lot of stuff that's coming to light now. So Fredo, if you're listening, paying attention, that is, if there ever is a second edition, a lot of interesting material is coming to light. So that was the end of 296. We did get a replacement aircraft. There was some litigation, and that's the replacement aircraft. You notice it is slightly modified. This is the aircraft that became A9605 in RAF service. Now it's with the US Border Command, doing patrols of the border with its radar. In RAF service, it was always accused of flying crooked, but the thing is still flying. And once again, that's covered in the book, why it's such a great aircraft now, and possibly always was. So let me just get the, as well as getting the replacement aircraft, and we got that about August in the following year, 69, there was a $2 million settlement. There's a lot of correspondence, and some of that sort of reflected in the book. But just so that I get the bad news out of the way first, up front, we had a subsequent maintenance incident that resulted in the loss of 300, another P3B. The wings of that aircraft, incidentally, went to the wing to re-wing an American airplane that had an accident. So that was interesting. And the other accident that you'd be aware of course, was the crash of 754 at Coke. Sadly, very sadly, with the loss of one life. Totally unnecessary, and again described in a fair amount of detail in the book. So moving right along, I mentioned before, aircraft arrived May 68. This is the then Minister Gordon Freeth welcoming Russ Law, Tom Trinder and Ned Segan, the captains of the first three aircraft to arrive. I mentioned before a couple of times Jeff Michael. He is a hero of the P3 story, as is former Deputy Chief of Air Staff Maritime, inaugural Maritime Patrol Group Commander Tom O'Brien. We, as you probably know, we took delivery of 3 separate lots of 10 P3s. Apart from the first 10 P3Bs, we had 10 P3Cs for 10 Squadron in 78, 79. Further 10, these are update 2.5s for 11 Squadron in 84, 86. And outside the period covered by the book, we had 4 second-hand P3Bs, 95 to 98. So I'm showing the photos of these two guys because there's a lot of pushback. A lot of people had their own expert opinion about what aircraft we should get. It's a bit like getting submarines, I suppose. Sir Arthur Tang, for example, had been pushing to get the Nimrod. There was a lot of Anglophilia around, and he maintained that position until Tom O'Brien took him flying in a P3B one day, and things changed after that. Jeff Michael led the P3C acquisition team, and when they went to Lockheed to start talking about the project, they followed the then Minister Lance Barnard and a senior public servant, a guy called Don Eldringham, to the factory, and they had told Lockheed that we wanted reconditioned P3Bs. So somehow, there's a very long story, but basically Jeff Michael stayed in town and got the Americans to come up with a proposal to produce or provide us with P3Cs, which basically happened. First of those arriving at Edinburgh, welcomed by 2 11 Squadron P3Bs in May 1978. Key thing here with the P3C is that introduced digital avionics to the RAF. You hear a lot about digital avionics with the F111. Well, the contract for that wasn't signed till August 1990. So the P3C, while once again the Cinderellas were out there with all this good kit, no one really knew about it. Bit about the conversion for the P3Cs, it didn't go well. It was done at Moffat again, but unfortunately, unlike the success of 11 Squadron's conversion, the conversion squadron operating out of Moffat didn't have the variant of the P3C that we were getting. They had them on the West Coast, I beg your pardon, the East Coast, but not the West Coast. So yeah, we had all sorts of problems there. 11 Squadrons also picked up theirs, but they came, by the time they went over there to pick up their aeroplanes, they'd already done their conversions at Edinburgh. Why Edinburgh? You know that 11 Squadron, when they were operating Neptunes, were at Richmond. It's probably political. I'm almost certainly political, but what we always used to say to everyone is a bit of a PR thing, I suppose, and it's real, is that from Edinburgh, you could be off the coast of anywhere in Australia within 4 hours flying time in a P3. So that was obviously pretty smart. Everyone is aware of as you mentioned, Marianne, just to make the point for me, thank you, Tony Bullimore and Thierry Dubois. And the reason everyone's aware of them is because HMAS Adelaide picked them out of the water. What, once again, has been airbrushed out of history is that about 2 weeks, not quite 2 weeks, but about 2 weeks before that, there was a separate rescue of another yachtsman in the same race, but it didn't involve the Navy. And I've got to give it to the Navy. Their public relations machine is outstanding, but the Navy was just outstanding. So if you recall the history, you'll think, okay, HMAS Adelaide rescued these guys. And there is a long story that starts with the early hours of Boxing Day 1996, where we went out looking for Raphael Donnelly. And his yacht was disabled in much the same way as the other two, except it ultimately righted itself. It had lost its mast, and that's what allowed it to right itself. The mast was acting as a keel on the other two. And he strapped himself onto the decks and waited to be rescued. The first aircraft found him, dropped dinghies to him, and what I might see if I can do is just scroll ahead and just I'll just scroll ahead to the slides, and I'll just show, since it's mentioned, what we used to do. We had these dinghies, which hopefully are on your screen now, and supply containers. They're called Air Sea Rescue Kit, and we would drop those. So we drop a stick of 4. They're joined by 75 meters of rope, and we'd drop them in a way that they would drift either towards the survivor in the water, or the survivor in a yacht would drift to them. And the photo of the drop I haven't got because it's outside the time frame of the book, but they did a textbook drop. The fellow was able to step from his yacht into a dinghy. His yacht sank 10 minutes later. So up till now, he'd been up to sort of knee-high water, depending on when the wave was washing and so on, and been like that for 22 hours. He got into the dinghy. The second sortie, P3 sortie, directed another yachtsman who came back 90 miles to pull this guy out of the dinghy and into his yacht. So that was the first of the 3. And we're sort of, I was there at the time. In fact, I had the very good fortune to be sitting in the job of OC 92 wing with my boss away and quite happy to trust me in the job, which was very kind of him, Des Long. And when the second rescue started, I called him up and said, look, this one looks like it's going to go a bit longer. You better come in and take over. And most people would probably say, yeah, I'll rush in and I'll do that. But Des was very, very kind and said, look, seem to be handling okay. I'll continue to enjoy my leave, thanks. And we went out there, found the 2 yachts. And at this time, there was no other yacht anywhere near. There was no merchant shipping. So late that Monday afternoon, HMAS Adelaide left Perth, about 4 o'clock local. I think they left Perth and headed down. And essentially, the P3's role was to sort of resupply Thierry Dubois, who got into one of the dinghies, and monitor the position of Tony Bullimore's yacht. And we certainly didn't know what was going on. But let me just see if I can just give a bit of animation so you can see what it looks like with these containers that are dropped from the bomb bay of the P3. So as you can see, they're joined by a rope, and they just it's a very well-rehearsed routine. It works extremely well, except that you see the white smokers in the water. It's white smoke markers in the water. They're perfect on a perfect day, but almost by definition, when we're doing this sort of stuff, it's never a perfect day. And the white smoke is lost. And for years, we've been asking for orange smoke or red smoke. And for years, that request has been ignored. So, so I think we've seen that now. We can move on to something else. But yeah, let me just, I guess, give you some pictures. A lot of surveillance, including the surveillance of the oil rigs. That was a bit of a government beat up. There was no real threat, but we spent probably a couple of years, 24 hours a day, flying up and down these oil rigs for political purposes. A lot of time out in the different parts of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. That's Kwajalein Atoll there, Cocos Island, Diego Garcia. Palatial accommodation at Diego, but don't judge a book by a cover. It doesn't look all that good from the outside, and it's just as bad inside. So Gateway, we could talk about for hours on its own, but that was cranked up in February 81, after the Iranian Revolution in November 79, followed by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So that Operation Gateway, you don't hear a lot about, but it is still going. It is the ADF's longest continuously run operation. And once again, I guess it's a maritime operation. You're not hearing about it, but we're sort of operating out of all these bases, and obviously Butterworth, the main base, and some of you recognise Penang. If you're not familiar with Butterworth, you've possibly been to Penang. It's just across the water. We used to see a lot of this sort of thing up there. This is a mine running into a maritime mine during the Iran-Iraq War, another one. Obviously, since there's an aeroplane audience here, you need to see some airplanes as well as ships. A lot of friendlies, a lot of Russians. This is a nuclear battle cruiser. It's the biggest surface combatant built. This is the Frunz, but it's one of 4 in the Kirov class. Biggest surface combatant built since World War II, nuclear powered, and all sorts of nasty missiles. These are the missile silos here. The Minsk Russian aircraft carrier. Not everyone, the Russians were very disciplined, but not everyone was. This is a Vietnamese patrol boat. This is just a still image, but from a video. The video shows this guy firing at the P3. We had a number of contacts fire at us. Some we can talk about, and others, like this one, others we can't. But it wasn't always sort of plain sailing, if we can put it that way. Similarly, this is a Russian space event, little sort of like a scaled down space shuttle type thing. Operations Caterpillar and N-Quarter, 82, 83. So 2 different operations. And when the guys were, when the guys, try to go back one, when the guys were sort of trying to monitor this Hormone helicopter was trying to fly through the cockpit of the airplane. So we had a bit of that. Any American battle group that would visit 200 miles out, you'd expect to visit. Some nice, pretty pictures. So these are just snapshots the guys took and provided to me for the book. Sometimes you'd have this sort of thing, a bear. The Indonesians were particularly aggressive. This one here, this is a warshot missile. They did not want us to be there. And the gateway routes, you can't help but sort of going to the bottom of the Malacca Straits, you cannot help but sort of be in their airspace. So in the time covered by the book, the routes that we flew were changed. So we just avoided that hassle. A little known role was transport, being an airliner, I guess, or based on an airliner. People like the comforts. This photo, if you can't recognize the airfield, and I'd be interested if anyone can, but in fact, it's Phan Rang in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The then Chief of Air Staff, Sir Colin Hanna, who was famous on many levels, wanted to visit Vietnam. P3 took him up there. And we also managed to get a would-be defector violinist out of Australia. Once again, the book covers that story. Harpoon was introduced on the P3, first fired Anzac Day 82. We carry up to 6, but obviously that nice happy pic shows 4 of them on the wings. High drag, obviously, and weight. So realistically, you're not counting that many. ASW was what the P3 was all about. The O boats arriving in 1968, the same time as the P3s. And just, I guess, a curious story in the context of today, since you wanted me to talk more recent stuff, Marianne, I'll talk about today, but this is 1969. In the context of all our discussions at the moment about nuke subs and the capability gap and all that sort of stuff, Australia's submarine capability between 1949 and 1969 was provided by the Royal Navy's 4th Submarine Squadron, based out of Sydney. This was the last of those submarines. They were T-class submarines, World War II vintage. This is the last of those submarines to depart Sydney. It went out flying a Jolly Roger, which it was entitled to do. It was the last British submarine to sink Japanese shipping in World War II, and its name was HMS Trump. So there's a diesel submarine. That's what you see with a diesel submarine. That's a nuclear submarine. This is your basic shipwrecky, but we did see lots of submarines transiting the Malacca Straits because it's too shallow to transit submerged. So this is the sort of thing we used to see. Once again, these are largely happy pics. We also operated in this area here, just off the coast of near Seattle. So that shaded area, Straits of Juan de Fuca, chasing Russian attack submarines. And they were there basically, there's Seattle there, Bremerton, circled. We're operating out of Courtenay, which is up in Vancouver Island. The Russian submarines were there waiting for the American submarines to come out of their base and deploy. So that whenever you find one submarine, the chances are you're going to find 2. We'd also operate with the Americans that operated out of there. Also chasing nuclear submarines, the ballistic missile firers. This is the Yankee East Pacific Missile Patrol Area. So these are Soviet submarines. We're operating either out of Barbers Point in Hawaii, on Oahu, or Moffat. And this was our target. Essentially, these are city killers. And the reason they operated, they could engage some of their targets from their home base, but they were out in the middle of the Pacific to get the targets on the east coast of America, but also shorter warning time for west coast targets. We didn't see them. We operated at altitude. They might have seen us. That's probably them looking at us. You'd never see one of those. Let me just go back, and probably at this stage of proceedings, this is probably how you're feeling. This photo, I like this photo. It reminds me of a scene in World War II where a crew are being debriefed. The scary thing about this photo, and you'll recognise some of the people, that Lee Collins is looking really, really ready for a sortie, because this was taken before the sortie during Kangaroo 81, where all sorts of atrocities happened in terms of crew duty times, and we were very lucky not to have had some accidents. But once again, a separate issue covered in the book. So with that, are there any questions? Have I got time for questions? Sorry, Marianne.
Yeah, no, please, sir. Yeah, just a couple of observations. I thought that was terrific. The story about 296, and I was just wondering, what happened to the wheel? Has that been was that souvenirs?
I don't know. I don't know, but you know, it's an interesting thought. You know, what had happened to it, but the key thing was that when this thing happened, well, first of all, Fred wrote. The CEO of the squadron, Russ Law, was out of town. In fact, he was flying a P3 at the time from Burbank back to Moffat. And so the aircraft captain, then squadron leader Tom Trinder, thought, well, I better ring the next best person. And he rang Fred Roby, the air attaché in Washington, and Fred wrote, and Tom, to be fair to Tom, wasn't flying the aircraft at the time, but that's by the by. The guy that was flying, Mick Dunn, did an outstanding job. And the good thing was there were many, many witnesses that watched this greased landing that they did. There was nothing wrong with the landing, but Fred Roby, with the benefit of the view he had from his office in Washington, said, "You obviously did a heavy landing." And Tom, when Tom said no, in words that President Macron might use, he said to Tom Trinder, "Don't you lie to me." Anyway, there was a bit of argy-bargy, and as I said earlier on, the upshot of it was we got a replacement aircraft, and there was also a $2 million payout made to the Australian government.
Yeah, that's what was very interesting. That I like your observation that some of the aircrew learnt to cook in the galley down the back. I don't think making an egg sandwiches from a fry pan is actually exactly cooking, but it was a good start anyway. So that was good.
Look, I mean, even on the P3Cs, I should say, the P3Cs couldn't have a frying pan because of the computers. They had toaster ovens, and so we essentially had frozen TV dinners as well as fresh rations. But some people were incredible. The guy I flew with, we would go into these things called a deep, where you'd chase a cooperating submarine for an hour. So we'd do all this, you'd be madly gyrating around. Just prior to that, he'd mix one of those Betty Crocker cake mixes, put it into one of those loaf tins in the little toaster oven, into the oven, I should say, not the toaster oven. The toaster oven is another story. That's a bit of a disaster almost. We had a fire on board with the toaster oven, but so he'd put it in the oven, set the timer, and we'd finish the deep, and then he'd be serving us slices of freshly made cake. So there was incredible innovation, but compared to the P3B, it was nothing. The P3B cooks were just outstanding.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in fact, I have had a couple of meals from the back of P3s when I was ADC. They managed to cook some really good meals for us. Just before we go on to some questions, it's very good that you highlighted the role of Jeff Michael. He's one of my heroes too. Of course, he served as an 18-year-old in Bomber Command, so a really diverse career. I know Peter Dunn. Peter, you've got a question?
Yeah, I'll just share a photo. As a 14-year-old, I saw the first three Neptunes arrive at Garbutt Airfield in Townsville. In those days, I called them a P2V7 Neptune, and I know you mentioned earlier they changed from P2V7 to SP2H. Do you know the reason why they changed?
Yeah, very good question, Peter. I've actually got because I reckon it's very interesting, and thanks for asking. I reckon because it is so interesting. Well, I thought it was interesting, and there was a story to be told, because there's so much confusion, and why is this, and people argue. But cut a long story short, the P2V5, P2V7 for the 11 Squadron and 10 Squadron Neptunes respectively, that was the Navy nomenclature. And it's like the Corsairs during World War II, F4U. And the letter stood for the manufacturer. Well, quite frankly, at the end of the day, who cares who the manufacturer is? But as I say, the V was Vega, which is the Lockheed plant, the Lockheed Vega plant. So in September 1962, they went over to a universal nomenclature. Okay. So basically, P for patrol, then the however many along you are. Like we had the P2 for the Neptune, and the P3 for the Orion. Yep. So basically, there wasn't this confusion between Navy nomenclature and Air Force and Army nomenclature. That's the short answer, but it's detailed. I've actually done an appendix in the book that specifically goes through the story.
Okay, thank you very much. I've had a few arguments with people over the years
you'll be able to win them with that book and help the government pay down the COVID debt at the same time.
Dion, you've got a question.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Ian, for a great talk. That's really interesting. I've always loved the maritime patrol side of the Air Force, and you've explained it really well. My question is a very quick one. We know that quite often, there is sometimes rivalry between squadrons or units in the Air Force. Was there much of a rivalry between 10 and 11, or were they too busy getting on with the job and that kind of thing?
Dion, I didn't cover that in the book. And the reason I didn't, I might have mentioned a bit of rivalry, but I didn't cover it in the detail that you're probably looking for. But the crew rooms at 10 and 11 Squadron were separated by the shower, toilet block, the ablutions block and so on and so forth, about 100, 200 metres, something like that. And I reckon it was the longest 200 metres in the world. There was a destructive rivalry between the two squadrons. When I've spoken to Tom O'Brien about that, now he was there at the time. He called in this. I saw it, I guess, as a sort of just a junior officer. I saw it, as a flight attendant at that time. I saw it at an operational level, and things weren't as friendly as they should be. Mm-hmm. And when I spoke to Tom O'Brien about it, he said it went right up to the COs. The COs were sort of if not encouraging, they weren't doing anything to stop it. Mm-hmm. So he read them the riot act, and things started to change, but a few other things started happening. 11 Squadron started getting P3Cs. They were getting their, as I mentioned earlier, when they went on to do their pickup, it was just a pickup, it wasn't a conversion. There were a couple of minor changes in the P3Cs that they picked up, and they got a bit of a conversion onto that over in the States, but essentially they did their P3C conversion at 292 Squadron, the OCU, if you like. Mm-hmm. And 292 Squadron at that stage was essentially populated by, and I was one of them, ex-10 Squadron people. So I remember the first 11 Squadron guys coming, and some of them were incredibly experienced, much more experienced than some of the instructors, but they were experienced on P3Bs. Yeah. And I remember some of the key players on day one were saying, well, we're going to change that. We're going to do this differently, and so on and so forth. And so I saw it, I guess, at the coalface, at the grassroots level. But once they, 11 Squadron was converted to the P3C, the magnificent DPO, and I thought this was an unclassified presentation. I wasn't going to mention DPO before, Marianne, but now it's out in the open. But essentially the personnel managers started cross-pollinating, if you like. So a bunch of 10 Squadron guys went to 11 Squadron and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And it was a combination of that and, I guess, the leadership of Tom O'Brien and smacking the COs about a bit that resolved that issue. And it's interesting now because, as you know, the way things have transpired, 11 Squadron is flying P8s, 10 Squadron is flying the last two P3Cs, and I'm not quite sure what the future is. But if any of you have been to Edinburgh and seen the new crew facilities there, they are magnificent, absolutely outstanding. But they built them on the basis of both squadrons operating the P8s. So there's 2 lots of executive officers, 2 lots of crew rooms, 2 briefing rooms, 2 of everything type thing. And it's just for 11 Squadron. So I saw the facilities just before they were occupied. I don't know how that's worked itself out, but I know space hates a vacuum, or nature hates a vacuum. So I'm sure they've been filled. But there's no doubt, it was a difficult time, and it shouldn't have been, but it was. And I guess there's always been a little bit of rivalry between 10 and 11, probably going back to the days when they were at Townsville and Richmond. And, 10 Squadron was always referred to as Brand X and so on and so forth. So, but I think that's well and truly in the past. I'd like to think it's well and truly in the past, but it was a bad time at the time.
Okay. Didn't realise it was that bad. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lou. Thanks. Do we have any other questions, ladies and gents? Yes, Bill.
I was there when 10 Squadron migrated down from North Queensland to Edinburgh and brought their plastic Charlies with them. And we were all ingrained in P3Bs at 11 Squadron. And I didn't see any aggressive rivalry. Sure, there was rivalry. I mean, they were operating a plastic can with a radar that was useless, an ESM which was markedly better than what we had in the P3B, but still useless. I guess the difference being that we've been operating the Bravos for so long. Yes, it was old, but we knew how to operate them. 10 Squadron was still learning what to do with these new plastic toys. So, but that wore off over the years. I came back after a stint instructing an SAN, flying on 11 Squadron, on 10 Squadron, and thoroughly enjoyed myself. So, yeah, and behind me you can see 605. I noticed you mentioned it during your presentation, sir. I'm glad to know it's still flying.
Bill Kirkwood, the chairman of the Judeans People Front.
Leaders.
Well, I got to say, because Bill was one of those guys that bounced between the squadrons, and I mean, when Marianne introduced me, she mentioned that I had a short attachment. I basically, they were down attack at one stage. I did a gateway with an 11 Squadron crew, and I have to say, they've been flying P3Cs, and so it's a bit of he said, she said, but they were still doing things on a P3C the way you do them on a P3B, and it was that sort of thing where people were reluctant to change. Now, 10 Squadron had by and large, in terms of the 10 Squadron culture, had the benefit of doing a fully immersive conversion over in America, where they're basically told, forget all that stuff that you knew before. This is the way you're going to do things now on a computerized aircraft. And it's a bit like, if I can use the analogy, when computers were introduced and we all suddenly had computers, people were using computers as a glorified word processor rather than using the total capability of a computer. And so the P3C was much more than a computerized P3B. But I even not even on 10 Squadron, probably 11 Squadron as well. But certainly at 92 Wing, because I sort of had the opportunity to observe crews from both squadrons and 292. There was one enhancement on the aircraft called the Sono reference system, where essentially you turn this thing on and it would tell you where all the sonobuoys were in real time, allowing for the drift. But no one trusted it. So instead we would have this thing where we'd go down at very low level, fly over a sonobuoy using essentially DFing techniques. So fly straight over the top of it, visually or electronically, and update the position of the buoys. It was very clumsy. It meant we're down at low level unnecessarily, wear and tear. Now, one of the later CEOs of 11 Squadron, Warren McDonald, did an exchange with the Canadians where he became very comfortable with SRS, Sonobuoy Reference System, and basically they used it. But as I say, both squadrons just weren't prepared to trust the technology sometimes, and they sort of reverted to more manual ways of doing business, which at the end were probably counterproductive.
Can I perhaps make a comment there? I think it's given our size of an Air Force, whenever we have two squadrons or more doing a similar role or doing the same role, it's something that creates some positive competition, but can also be fraught with danger. And if I look from my trash hauler experience with C-130s, the E versus the H model debate in 36-37, and we had the scenario where 36 Squadron were really pushing their aircraft under the guise of they were tactical, and the E model guys were being a bit more conservative, and that did create a lot of antagonism between the squadrons, to the point, unfortunately, where 36 Squadron were actually pushing their aircraft so hard, trying to prove a point, they were actually shedding turbines around the world because they were overstressing the engine. So there's there's a positiveness to the competition, and I know it even happens in the Hornet world as well, and I believe it may have been between 1 and 6 squadrons. So it's always that fine edge and something that needs to be capitalized on, but also have constraints at times. So it's just interesting dilemma, and I'd be interested to know whether the Americans and other air forces suffer the same thing. I expect they do.
Yeah, I think, look, yeah, I hope I haven't over-egged it, because overwhelmingly, you know, that was a particular time. And as I say, Tom O'Brien, once he became aware of it being the issue that it was, took fairly decisive action to stop it. But that said, there were other things happening in the background. Early in the presentation, I showed a picture of 754 sitting in the lagoon, and that was dare I say it, a bit of showboating. I described the incident with a fair amount of detail, without I guess caning people too severely, but that was a completely unnecessary loss of life and a loss of aircraft. And when you look at the flying safety aspects of it, you look at, well, how did this guy get to the stage where he thought that that was a reasonable thing to do, and who was paying attention to him? And most of you, I guess, will be aware of the B-52 that crashed in Alaska when practicing for a air show. A guy called Bud Holland was the captain, and the parallels between Bud Holland and the guy flying the P-3C that crashed at Cocos, and the circumstances that led up to it, are really, really scary, to the extent that as case studies, when we used to have a Air Force single service phase in Staff College, those two scenarios were both studied to just, I guess, alert people to their duties as supervisors, not just in flying, but in the Air Force in general.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, sir. Do we have any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? No one else? Well,
I think Adam Lundy had a question, didn't you, Adam?
Yes, thanks. I did at the start. It must have been missed. That's okay. Thank you for your presentation, sir. I just had a general question about Orions. Any piece of equipment that an agency buys off the shelf is never exactly what it wants. So how were the Australian Orions different to the American ones in general terms?
I think in general terms they weren't, but the big difference was that we had the British acoustic system fitted. So we Australia and the British had jointly developed the Sono, and as a consequence of that, when the aircraft were delivered, they had these great big holes in them at the acoustic stations where the AQS 901 acoustic processor was fitted. So that was probably the most significant difference. There are other minor differences. For example, at the nav station in the P-3C, in American aircraft, they have LORAN, a navigation system, and in our aircraft, we didn't have that because LORAN was optimized for the Americans' area of operations in the north, not where we operate. So we never took delivery of it. Interestingly, and it was something I got involved in, and the engineers might cringe at me saying this, but the barometric altimeter at the nav station when we took delivery of the aircraft was located right at the top of the station. So when you're in what we call condition 5 for takeoff and landing with a helmet on, with the little nape strap at the back of the helmet, it was nigh on impossible to see the barometric altimeter, which is a big part of the NAV's job, to monitor that during approaches and so on. We didn't have a radar altimeter, but I eventually successfully prevailed on the engineers, with the support of the CO, to have the altimeter move to the position occupied by the blank plate where the LORAN would have been, and display would have been, right in the eye line of the nav. And I remember the engineers saying to me, well, why do you even want a barometric altimeter at all? Because you've got a feed out of the altitude on the computer screen. The trouble is that the computer readout of the altitude was driven by a barometric altimeter, but there was a synchro to digital converter, which routinely slipped 200 or 300 feet. And at low level monitoring approach, that's the last thing you wanted. But it was quite interesting to see just that different perspective of okay, the engineers are looking at, well, you've already got it. Why do you want something else as well? And as I'm not having a go at engineers, I'm just saying it's just a different perspective depending on what seat you sit in, quite literally. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there are other minor tweaks that we had, but as I say, the AQS 901 was the biggie, and by and large, we stayed true to the American system. The other thing I would say, though, that's sort of hardware. Software, we ran the CP901, central computer, sort of integrated all the different inputs, for example, from the acoustic processor and so on and so forth, to give a coherent feed that would result in, for example, a bearing line from a barra station, from a barra buoy displaying on the TACO screen, or if we wanted to, the TACO could put it on the pilot screen. That software we developed in-house. So we got the original baseline program from the Americans, and we had a committee that was populated by representatives from each of the flying squadrons and so on, and the people that did the work on the computers, on the software. And all being based at Edinburgh, it was pretty easy for us to reach agreement on any changes and upgrades. And we had some terrific upgrades. We're doing things long before the Americans did them, because it was very easy for us to get together and agree an upgrade or a change. The Americans were sort of deployed literally around the world. It was very difficult for them. So when we released version 7 of the OP program, I remember I had the opportunity, a fellow called Keith Brackenbury was running it, and he managed to set up a demonstrator, if you like, with our program, version 7, and the latest American program. And quite frankly, the latest American program looked like what we had when we took delivery of the aircraft. It hadn't really progressed. Interestingly, now with the Poseidons, the P8s, we're in an arrangement with the Americans where we jointly develop the software. Now that obviously has its cost advantages, but I don't think we're as agile as we once were. A lot of the work was contracted out to Computer Sciences Australia. They worked at Edinburgh as part of Air Force teams that had an op program manager that was aircrew, and an op program engineer who was obviously an engineer, RAF guys. And it worked beautifully in the what was called INSO flight at 292 Squadron, Integration and Software Development. I don't test me on the acronym now, but INSO, or as we called it, RINSO flight. But they absolutely did an outstanding job. And to me, it's one of those things that sort of you don't obviously notice unless you're involved in it. But that to me was probably the big thing, along with the AQS 901. Well, as it turns out now, the P8 has the American fitted, and it's much more than the P3 ever was, as bought off the shelf aircraft.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Any more questions, ladies and gents? Doesn't look like it. Well, look, thanks very much, sir. Look, it sounds like a fantastic read. I mean, and what a tribute to the crew, you know, the unsung heroes, really, the crew and this magnificent aircraft over all those years. And I'm really looking forward to reading it myself and learning more about the operations. And I just think I'll just end here with a letter that a Wing Commander Pearson received once when he was acting CEO of 92 Wing. It's not every day you get a letter from the Prime Minister. He said, "I'd like to extend my congratulations to you for your superb job that you and your men have done in rescuing the 2 stranded yachtsmen. People around the world watch your efforts and hope the 2 sailors could be brought back to safety. You and your rescue team delivered an outcome many believe was not possible, considering the dangerous circumstances in which you carried out your work. Australians are proud of the way you've conducted yourselves with complete professionalism, and your efforts in Antarctic conditions merit our unreserved admiration. Please pass on my personal thanks and the best wishes of my government to your crew. Sincerely, John Howard." And I think that probably sums it up. You know, that's Australians now that they'll know more about the operations of P3. I think we'll be rightly proud of the crews and the work in this magnificent aircraft. So thank you very much.
Can I just add a footnote to that, Marianne, if I may? You know, I'm not short of a word. Having been my very loyal, hard-working, long-suffering staff, obviously years ago, but immediately after that, so that was early January. There was Australia Day, and I had the dubious honour of being invited to the Sydney Myer Music Bowl to receive an award on behalf of the ADF. And the award was essentially a framed certificate, which I managed to get photographed at 492 Squadron Photo. Oh, no, it was 92 Wing Photo. They worked for me. Anyway, perks of the job. But I got this thing photographed, and the prints of the photograph are better than the original certificate. But I have some for the history if you want them, Fredo. But no one briefed me at all what the format of the evening was going to be. Nothing, no briefing, nothing. It was just, so you're going to get this award, and didn't know what the award looked like or anything. And was in this enclosure at the Sydney, in the grounds of the Sydney Myer Music Bowl, and people were drinking and what I can only describe as buckets, but they were big plastic cups of Yellow Glen bubbly. And I thought, no, I can't do that. Better not. You know, I could be getting up and having a speaking role. And I obviously had to get up on stage. But once I got up on stage and basically John Howard handed this framed certificate to me, that was it. And I was back to the buckets of bubbly, I can tell you.
Well deserved too. Yeah, that's terrific. Add that story to your memoir, sir. There we go. Well,
before we wrap up, Marianne, I just a couple of things. Firstly, Ian mentioned there about Operation Gateway. Online here, we've got Martin Ball, and Martin's actually putting together another book for us. It'll come out in about, well, not sure, Martin. We'll have to have a chat later. But he's putting out a book specifically on Operation Gateway. It'll a different format from Ian's, but I think it'll be a good complementary one to it, and it'll take probably some of the information a bit further. And the other thing I just want to say is Marianne, even though she's offered to do the next Friends of Air Force History and Heritage Zoom meeting in December, she's actually leaving us next Friday for a fantastic job on basically going to another area for 2 years on a contract, working in an inquiry team. And I just want to say publicly, for the 5 years that Marianne's been working in this branch, she's done a fantastic job, has really set the foundations for the branch going forward in terms of what we do in community engagement and communication. So on my behalf and on behalf of all of us who work in the branch, Marianne, and everyone here today, thank you very much, and good luck, good wins, and blue skies in your new role.
Yes. So who'd have thought at my stage of my career? Yeah, thank you. So no, thank you. It's been terrific after almost 10 years working in complaint resolution areas and doing inquiries. When the branch was set up, I thought, oh, gee, I've got to get myself over there. and it's been terrific. So I've really enjoyed it. But going back to a similar sort of role in the Afghan Inquiry Review Task Force. So it'll be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to looking after everyone over there. So thanks very much. I'll be sending out all of the details about the December Friends. And it's been suggested by Group Cap Fredo that perhaps we might put out a bit of a survey to see if people would like to have the presentations of an evening rather than during the day, and then we might be able to capture a few more people that aren't working. So go from there. All right then, ladies and gentlemen. Well, thanks once again to our wonderful presenter. And, see you later, everyone. See you in December.